The story you're about to hear is not a sermon. It's not a parable or a legend passed down through generations. It is something different, something quietly documented, recorded on machines built to explore the outer boundaries of human understanding. It comes from a place where science lives, NASA. Yes, that NASA. The organization synonymous with rockets, satellites, spacewalks, and lunar missions. But what if I told you that within the walls of a NASA-affiliated research project, scientists stumbled upon something they could not explain? Something that didn't belong to science, and yet, it was captured on scientific equipment. It didn't happen on the moon, or in the vacuum of space, or in some deep underground facility. No, this happened in a hospital. A room like any other, quiet, sterile, with the scent of antiseptic clinging to the walls. NASA scientists were there to study how the human body reacts to stress, particularly the kind experienced in extreme environments like space travel. As part of their work, they had access to a specialized camera system, one capable of detecting energy fields surrounding the human body. These fields, sometimes referred to as biofields or auras, were visualized on monitors in subtle colors, glowing faintly like heat signatures in the cold. For the purposes of the study, NASA received permission to observe terminally ill patients. The goal was to document how these energy fields behaved in the final moments of life, how the body shut down, how energy faded, and perhaps even whether something of it lingered after death. At first, the patterns were consistent. The researchers sat in a control room behind a two-way mirror, their eyes locked on the glowing outlines projected on the screen. As patients declined, their energy fields dimmed. The once glowing forms became faint. Then, as the final breath was taken, the energy simply vanished, disappearing as if someone had flipped off a light switch. It was sobering, even for men and women trained to remain emotionally detached. These weren't just charts. They were watching life itself disappear. But then came him. The patient wasn't special in any medical sense. He was elderly, quiet, nearing the end. What made this event different was a visitor, someone who arrived just as the patient's energy began to fade. On the screen, his outline flickered dimly, almost gone. The visitor didn't speak loudly or rush in. He walked in slowly, reverently, holding something close to his chest. The researchers assumed it was a Bible. Perhaps a last moment of comfort for the dying man. But then, the monitors exploded with light. What the scientists saw next would challenge the very framework of their understanding. From the visitor's pocket, where a small, circular object was gently cradled, an intense light began to radiate. It wasn't visible to the naked eye in the hospital room. The nurses reported nothing unusual. But through the lens of the energy field camera, something beyond comprehension was happening. The glow was concentrated, powerful, and unlike any signature the machine had ever detected. It moved slowly at first, like a ripple through water. Then it expanded, covering the entire patient's body in a radiant field of light. The scientists froze. Was this an error? A glitch? They checked their instruments. Recalibrated. Nothing changed. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. It filled the entire monitor. They could see the patient's aura being restored, not fading. And the source was unmistakable. The visitor was holding a pyx, a small, sacred container used in the Catholic Church to carry the consecrated host, the Eucharist. For several minutes, the energy on the screen grew stronger. It didn't plateau. It didn't fade. It expanded, until even the walls of the room, as seen on the energy field monitor, were pulsing with light. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the visitor knelt, whispered a prayer, and left. The host was never unwrapped. The patient never spoke. But the cameras had recorded everything. The data was saved, timestamped, analyzed. And yet, no explanation could be found. The scientists didn't know what to do with the footage. There were no equations to define it. No physics formula could replicate it. It didn't match any known frequency of light or heat or radiation. It didn't belong to the world of testable phenomena. For one of the scientists, the event became more than a curiosity, it became a moment of conversion. He was a man in his early 50s. A veteran of space telemetry and advanced sensor systems. By all accounts, he had lived a life governed by reason. But something had shifted inside him that day. The data told him what his eyes could not. Someone had entered the room carrying not just a wafer of bread, but something divine. Within months, that man left his position at NASA. Quietly. Respectfully. He didn't go public. He didn't try to publish a study or monetize a book. Instead, he enrolled in seminary. Today, he is a Catholic priest. And though he rarely speaks of the event, those close to him know the truth. He never forgot the light. But that's not where the story ends. Because the Eucharist, the quiet, often misunderstood centerpiece of Catholic worship, has a pattern of showing up in places it's least expected. From scientific labs to war zones, from the richest cathedrals to the humblest village huts, it arrives silently, humbly, in the hands of someone unseen. And often, it leaves behind a trail of light only visible to those who are looking with the eyes of the soul. The NASA incident is not the first time the sacred has collided with the scientific. And it won't be the last. But for those who have spent their lives chasing after evidence, this event served as a signpost, pointing beyond equations and algorithms to something older, deeper, more mysterious. Something eternal. What the NASA scientists witnessed that day was not, in their minds, religious. Not at first. It was energy. Light. A data anomaly, maybe, something curious, unexpected. But for those who believed, it was confirmation. Not just of faith, but of something the Church had always held true, that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Yet the question remains: was this an isolated incident? It wasn't. Across the world, and across time, the Eucharist has made itself known, not just through faith, but through physical science. Visible events. Miracles caught not just on film, but in the heart. Let's turn now to another moment, another screen, another camera. But this time, not NASA. Buenos Aires, Argentina. 1996. It was a quiet evening in the parish of Santa Maria in Buenos Aires. A priest was preparing to lock up the church when he noticed something unusual. A discarded host, left at the back of the church, partially tucked under a pew. According to Catholic teaching, a consecrated host is never thrown away. If dropped or desecrated, it is either consumed or placed in water until it dissolves. Following protocol, the priest placed the host in a container of water and locked it in the tabernacle. He expected it to dissolve in a few days. But days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Not only did the host not dissolve, it changed. It began to bleed. The white wafer transformed into a fleshy substance, red, pulsing, alive. Disturbed but faithful, the priest contacted his bishop. That bishop would later become Pope Francis. A team of scientists, agnostic and unaware of the host's origin, were brought in to study the sample. The results stunned them. It wasn't just blood. It was living human tissue. More specifically, cardiac muscle. The tissue belonged to a human heart, still alive at the time the sample was taken. It showed signs of stress, indications that the man had been beaten, tortured, or traumatized. There was no explanation. The sample had not been refrigerated. It had been sitting in a container of water for weeks. It should have decayed. Instead, it pulsed with life. One of the scientists, deeply moved by the results, later returned to faith. He had spent a lifetime studying the human heart, but now he had encountered the Sacred Heart. Lanciano, Italy. Circa 780. Centuries earlier, a monk stood at the altar in Lanciano. He was celebrating Mass, but privately, he doubted. He questioned whether the bread and wine truly became the body and blood of Christ. As he lifted the host, his hands trembled. Then, before his eyes, the wafer transformed. It bled. The wine in the chalice turned thick, dark, congealed. He fell to his knees. What he held in his hands was not bread and wine. It was flesh and blood. Centuries later, modern science stepped in. The Church approved the testing of the preserved relics. Under strict conditions, the samples were analyzed. The verdict? Human flesh and human blood, type AB. The same as the Shroud of Turin. The flesh was, again, cardiac tissue, a heart under duress. It had not decayed. It showed no preservatives. And yet, it remained whole. The scientists had no explanation. The faithful already had one. How do we explain it? Coincidence? Hallucination? A trick of the senses? But what about when machines record it? What about when multiple samples across time and geography reveal the exact same result? Heart tissue, blood type AB, signs of trauma? What about when cameras, like the one used by NASA, pick up on a light not visible to the naked eye yet consistent across Eucharistic encounters? Are these all accidents? Or are they invitations? Because here's what's so often missed in stories like these: the miracles are not about proving God exists. They're about reminding us that He is close, that He is here. And the means He chooses is not thunder from heaven, but a small white host. A piece of unleavened bread. So small it fits between your fingers. So silent it can be ignored. So sacred it contains eternity. Let's go back to the NASA story for a moment. The scientist who left to become a priest, he didn't become a preacher shouting on street corners. He didn't launch a podcast or start a movement. He began offering daily Massachusetts. Quietly. Reverently. Knowing that every time he lifted the host, he wasn't holding a symbol. He was holding the same light that filled that hospital room years ago. He once told a fellow seminarian, "I spent my whole life chasing after stars, and I missed the one that comes to the altar every morning." The Church teaches that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. That in every consecrated host, He comes, whole and entire. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. He is there. Body. Blood. Soul. Divinity. And if the stories you've heard so far move your heart, it's because the soul recognizes something ancient. Something eternal. Something true. There's a reason the most powerful Eucharistic miracles are rarely accompanied by fanfare. They happen in quiet rooms. In villages and dumps and back pews. On cameras not meant to capture heaven. Because that's where He meets us, where the veil is thinnest. Not with drama, but with presence. There's something uniquely humbling about a miracle. Not just because it bends the laws of science, but because it reshapes the soul. Time and again, we've heard stories where the Eucharist appears not only as a theological claim, but as a living presence, captured by machines, seen in vision, or encountered in the deepest chambers of suffering. But what happens after the miracle? What happens to the people who witness them? That may be the most powerful part of all. Let's begin with a story that wasn't caught on camera, but was forever etched into a man's heart. Father Richard, a diocesan priest in a small Midwestern town, spent his early years as a skeptic, yes, even in seminary. He believed in the sacraments. He believed in the Church. But he often thought of the Eucharist as symbolic, beautiful, yes, but not literally Christ. Then one morning during daily Mass, something changed. He had just finished the consecration. The host rested in his hand, lifted in quiet reverence. The sunlight streamed through the chapel window, catching the gold of the chalice. And then, just for a moment, he saw him. Jesus. Standing just beyond the altar, clothed in white. Hands outstretched. Eyes full of mercy. Father Richard blinked. The image was gone. But it had been real. He finished the Mass in silence. And afterward he wept. From that day forward, he began spending hours in Eucharistic adoration. Not out of obligation. Out of love. He stopped preaching abstract theology. Instead, he preached encounter, telling his congregation, "He's here. Whether you feel it or not. He's here." There are others. A young woman in Manila who battled depression so severe she had once planned her exit. One evening, walking past a church she hadn't entered in years, she heard music. Soft, distant. She stepped inside. Mass was ending. People were kneeling. A priest walked down the aisle, holding a monstrance. And though she didn't understand what it was, something pulled her to her knees. As the Eucharist passed, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. Like sunlight, but from the inside. For the first time in years, the weight lifted. No voices. No visions. Just peace. She later said, "I didn't know what I had encountered, but I knew I had met someone." And then, there are the stories of those healed not in body, but in soul. A prisoner in Colombia serving life for violent crimes was visited by a priest who offered him communion. At first, the man refused, ashamed, angry, closed off. But something about the priest's eyes softened him. He agreed. That night, he had a dream. Christ, bleeding but smiling, stood at the bars of his cell and said, "You are not beyond my mercy." The next morning, the man confessed everything. He didn't just turn to faith, he became a catechist, teaching other inmates about the Eucharist. And years later, he told a visiting bishop, "I never knew freedom until I met him in that piece of bread." You see, the Eucharist doesn't just convert minds. It restores hearts. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It waits. Quietly. On every altar. In every tabernacle. And when someone is ready, it speaks. Let's return, for a moment, to the NASA scientist who became a priest. There's a story, shared only in quiet circles, of a Mass he celebrated years after his ordination. It was a Tuesday morning. The church was nearly empty. Just him, a sacristan, and a few elderly parishioners. During the consecration, as he lifted the host, he paused. A few noticed. His hands trembled. Slightly. Then he closed his eyes, held the host close to his chest, and whispered a prayer. Too faint for anyone to hear. After Mass, someone asked, "Father, are you okay?" He smiled gently. "I just saw the light again," he said. These are the real miracles. Not just bleeding hosts or glowing images on monitors, but the transformation of a person. A scientist who gives up status to follow silence. A doubting priest turned adorer. A suicidal girl brought back by sacred light. A murderer turned missionary. The miracle is that he still comes. Maybe you've never seen a glowing monitor. Maybe you've never heard a whisper in adoration. Maybe Mass feels ordinary. routine. But that doesn't mean he isn't there. Because this isn't about feelings. It's about reality. If the Eucharist is truly Jesus, if he is truly present, then that small white host is the most powerful force in the universe. More than rockets. More than planets. More than miracles we can measure. And maybe, just maybe, that's why God chooses to come to us in that way. Not as thunder, but as bread. So we won't fear him. So we can hold him. So we can be held. We began this story in a NASA lab. Among machines, instruments, cameras designed to measure what we call real. And what we found was light. Not metaphorical light. Not poetic. Not symbolic. A measurable field. A radiant pulse. Caught by a camera, and unexplainable by science. But that light didn't come from a reactor. Or a star. Or a satellite. It came from a man's pocket. And within that pocket, a consecrated host, the Eucharist. That's where we started. But by now, we've gone far beyond the lab. We've stood beside a dying patient. Watched the energy fade. Then return. Not because of medicine, but because of presence. We've walked the dusty plains of Argentina, where a discarded host became flesh and blood. Proven under the microscope. Identified as hard tissue, alive. We visited a Mexican garbage dump, where the poorest of the poor bowed in reverence. And a burned child was healed beneath an altar. We've seen a girl in despair feel warmth for the first time in years. A priest fall to his knees as the host turned radiant in his hands. A murderer reborn with tears and the taste of mercy on his tongue. Over and over again, across centuries and continents. He comes. Not for the famous. Not for the theologians. Not for the elite. But for the hungry. The broken. The tired. The lost. The ready. And yet, here's the quiet tragedy of it all. In a world obsessed with proof, with visibility, with the spectacular, the most real thing of all is overlooked. Because it's small. Because it's quiet. Because it waits. The Eucharist. In churches with cracked walls and flickering candles. In tabernacles that sit in silence all night. In the hands of a priest at 6 a.m. weekday Massachusetts. In the pics of a chaplain walking into a hospital room. He is there. Not as a concept. Not as a memory. Not as a symbol. But as Jesus. Body. Blood. Soul. Divinity. And so we must ask ourselves, how would we live if we truly believed that? If we believed that Christ himself waited behind the golden door of the tabernacle, that the King of Kings lay hidden beneath a veil of bread, that the Creator of galaxies humbles himself to be held between our fingers? How would it change the way we walk into church? The way we kneel? The way we receive? So often, we pray for signs. We cry out for proof. We say, God, show me you're real. But what if the answer has already come? What if the miracle is already here? And it's just waiting. Patiently. For eyes to see? The NASA scientist saw it. Not with his religion, but with his equipment. He saw what centuries of saints already knew. That light surrounds him. That when he enters the room, everything changes. He saw it. And he believed. And he followed. Not because he was holy, but because he was honest. Because he knew that some things cannot be explained, only adored. Narrator voice softens even more. So maybe, this isn't just a story. Maybe it's an invitation. To step out of routine. To return to all. To walk into a church, not with distraction or habit, but with hunger. To kneel again. Not because you feel worthy, but because he is. The miracle isn't just that he shows up. The miracle is that he stays. through our doubts, through our sin, through every generation. He doesn't leave. He waits. In the host, in the chalice, in the monstrance, in the silence, waiting to be seen, to be loved, to be received. So what now? Maybe visit a chapel, even for 5 minutes. Sit there, in the stillness. No music, no agenda, no pressure, just presence. And maybe you won't see a light. Maybe you won't feel anything. But he'll be there. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the whole point. Because the greatest miracles are not the ones that change the world. They're the ones that change you. And it all begins with a piece of bread. That is not bread. It's Jesus. He is here. Truly present. Still waiting. Still healing. Still loving. Still light.